Hello and welcome to the Open Dental webinar for the Standard Production and Income Report. Before we actually get to the report, there are a few topics that we need to discuss first. These will affect different things about how the report will actually function, as well as explain a little bit of the information that we're going to see on that report. So the topics that we're going to cover are provider fee schedules, insurance fee schedules, the differences between the two. We'll also cover adding production to appointment views, the differences between adjustments and write-offs, and then we'll eventually get to reports at the end, and we'll actually talk about the production and income report, and we'll take a look at what that looks like. So the first thing to talk about are office fees. Office fees are also referred to as UCR fees, or usual, customary, and reasonable fees. These are essentially what the provider will charge in absence of any insurance or discounts or any of that sort of stuff. To assign a fee schedule to a provider, this is going to be the way, this is essentially synonymous with setting your office fees. So we'll do this in lists and then providers. This is going to be the list of all of the providers that we have in this practice right now. What you'll want to do is go ahead and double click on the provider, and usually you'll just make sure that they have either office fees or UCR fees or whatever you have your office fee schedule title it as. That's the one you'll want to select. Very rarely will you have to change this to be something other than your office fees or UCR fees. And most offices will do that for all of their providers. So all your hygienists and primary providers as well. Another thing that you can do in this window is associate an hourly production goal to a provider. We'll take a look at this in just a moment, but a general overview of how this works is that it'll take the amount of hours worked for a provider in a day and multiply it by this number. So if Dr. Baxter, if we expect him to produce maybe $180 an hour or that sort of thing, that's a number, that's a figure that you can put in here. The next thing we'll want to do is take a look at the difference between office fees and insurance fees. So we'll go into lists and then procedure codes to do that. This should just pull up your fee 1 here. It should always just be your office fees. You can change the fee schedule that's in this first column if you'd like to. You can just change it from the dropdown, but this is just going to be the one that pulls up by default. It's also going to correspond to this fee 1 here. So you'll notice that these columns are named according to these areas that you're able to select fee schedules. And that's just going to make it so that you can pull up to 3 fee schedules at the same time and compare them. So if I want to take a look at an insurance fee schedule, I can pull that up in fee 2. Maybe we'll do in-network insurance here. And then you'll see we've got our office fee in the first column and then the insurance fee in the second column. Most of the time when a provider is in network with an insurance carrier or an insurance plan, what that means is that that provider will reduce their fees to whatever the insurance's allowed amount is. So let's say, for instance, for this oral evaluation here, the insurance is basically saying you're only allowed to charge $66 for this procedure, even though we know that you would normally be able to charge $90. Because this person happens to be a network, you can only really charge them $66. And that difference you're never really expecting or anticipating to collect on. What you are able to do with that difference between the two is essentially write it off on your taxes at the end of the year. So this difference here between these two fees is just going to be $24. But the nice thing about setting it up this way in Open Dental is that it'll essentially do the math for us when we set up an insurance plan using the recommended way we'll take a look at in just a sec. So let's go ahead and close out of here, and then we'll go to Clark Baldwin's account here. If we head into the family module, this is going to be where insurance plans for the patient are going to live. So you'll see that there's a pretty brief summary here. It'll have a lot of different information about this patient's insurance plan, or if we want to take a closer look or edit anything, we can go ahead and double click. So here's all the information about the insurance plan, but the main things that we want to take a look at are these plan type and fee schedule here. You'll notice there are other places to add fee schedules to insurance plans. Those are mostly just going to be more specialized. When you're talking about a typical in-network insurance plan, you'll basically want to put their fee schedule in this area right here. This is what allows the program to do that automatic calculation that we were talking about, where it automatically takes the difference between the provider's fees and the insurance fee and turns that into a write-off. For plan type, in-network insurance plans will typically just be PPO percentage, or sometimes if the insurance carrier is paying a fixed amount, you can also do PPO fixed benefit. The other plan types will work fine, they just won't track write-offs. So usually we recommend using those for stuff like Medicaid plans or out-of-network insurance plans where you don't take any write-offs. So once we've got our fee schedule and our plan type set, we'll go ahead and click OK. And to take a look at how this is calculating, let's head over to the treatment plan module. This is going to be pretty similar to actually the window that we had pulled up in lists and then procedure codes. So we can even pull it up once more. So over in this fee column, just like that fee 1 column, you've got your provider fees essentially. So again, that's just how much the provider would charge in absence of any coverage or that sort of thing. The second column here is going to be their allowed amounts. So whichever fee schedule we've attached to the insurance plan, that's where these are coming from. So that's our fee 2. Your primary insurance is going to be how much you think that they're going to cover. So this will change more freely. This will change just depending on your insurance plan setup, how many benefits the patient has used this year, all that sort of stuff can affect your calculations. But your fee and your allowed will basically be unchanged. That write-off, so the difference between these two fee schedules, that's going to show up as a discount. You can technically change the name of this column to read something like in-network insurance write-off or just write-off or whatever you want to put in there, and that's totally fine, but just by default it'll say discount because this isn't anything that the patient is going to have to pay for. The next thing we'll talk about are production totals in the appointments module, as well as how to different ways to have them calculate. So you'll notice over here we've got daily production and daily goal. Right now there's nothing in there, but what we can do is we can have the program calculate those figures for us for the day, or whichever date range we're looking at. So if you go to Setup and then Preferences, the first step in this process is to determine how you want these preferences to be set up. So they're pretty self-explanatory. If you want daily adjustments to calculate towards your net production, you can check that box. The second one is a little less self-explanatory. Basically, what it does is that it determines what the program is going to use to calculate those production numbers. So there's two options. You can have it use your operatories, so whichever operatories are showing in your appointment view, or by default, if this box is unchecked, what it'll do is it'll use the provider bars that are associated to that appointment view, which are these little colored bars over here on the left-hand side. So if this is unchecked, again, which is how this works by default, then you'll want to make sure that your provider bars are properly associated to your appointment views. So let's go ahead and hit OK. That's the first step. The second step is to actually add those items to your appointment view. So you can go to Setup, Appointments, and then Appointment Views. These are going to be your existing appointment views. You can either double click on an existing one to edit it or just add an entirely new one if you'd like. For now, let's just double click the F1 view. Depending on the preference that you selected in the previous step, whether you're using operatories or provider bars, you'll want to make sure that you have whichever ones you want to factor in to that production number, you'll want to have them highlighted here. So for instance, if I want Dr. Baxter's operatories to calculate, I'll want to grab both of those. Or if you're not using operatories, if you're using the provider bars instead, you'll want to do that instead. They're not mutually exclusive. You can do both at the same time as well, which is probably more common. You'll have provider bars and operatories. If I'm just using the provider bars, if I don't want Dr. Flynn's production to factor into that number over there, we can just take him off of there. The next thing you'll want to do is add your production and or net production from your available rows in here. You'll have to scroll down a little bit most likely, and then you'll see we've got production and net production here. You can highlight whichever one you want to add, and then hit this right arrow button to move it over to essentially display on your appointments. That'll also make the total pop up as well. So we'll do production, and then we can also do net production as well. And that's about it. It's just those three things. So once we hit OK, we can close out of there. You can see that we've got all of those numbers populating now. So our total production for the day is essentially $450. Our net production for the day is going to be $361. And that's going to take into account adjustments, write-offs, estimated write-offs, that sort of thing. We've also got that goal that we kind of touched on a little briefly earlier. Since Dr. Baxter is scheduled to these operatories, it essentially takes the amount of time that he's scheduled for and multiplies that by whichever number we put in that provider setup window. There's also two things that you'll want to take into account when you're using this feature in OpenDental. The first is that you'll need to attach procedures to appointments, which if you're not doing that already, it's probably a good idea to do so. That's a recommended workflow. And the second thing that you'll want to keep in mind is that these numbers are always going to use the date of service for any write-offs. And we'll get more into that and what that means in just a moment. But essentially, any write-offs are always going to be applied on the date of service. The next thing we'll take a look at are adjustments. So adjustments are going to be in OpenDental potentially a little different than other practice management softwares. In OpenDental, adjustments are going to be different than write-offs. They're kind of quantified a little differently. Adjustments are mostly going to be things like a charge towards a patient, or a discount, or if you accidentally billed out the wrong fee and you want to fix it. Instead of going and changing the fee on the procedure, you can add an adjustment to essentially compensate for the difference. So if we want to quantify just our adjustments, we can go into reports and then standard up top here. And then we'll take a look at the adjustments report. Let's just go ahead and run that for last week there, so the 14th through the 18th. You can see some of the adjustment types that we have in our system here. And let's go ahead and hit OK. And this is going to show you the adjustment type, the provider it was attributed to, the things like the patient name and the date, just for information. And if there are any notes on the adjustment, it'll show those as well. Any subtractions in this amount column are going to be essentially discounts that you're giving to your patients. So if you have people on like a membership plan, or if you happen to give cash patients a discount, or that sort of thing, that's how those will show up on this report. Any positive amounts are going to be essentially charges towards the patient. So if we accidentally billed out a fee that was too small, these fee increases are going to be positive adjustments because we're charging the patient a little more. Or if you're charging them for, like, say, a broken appointment, or if they canceled last minute, or that sort of thing. If it's your office's policy to charge that patient, this is how you can have those show up. Really, the only thing to keep in mind is that write-offs kind of look like adjustments in more ways than one, but they're treated a little differently in OpenDental. So the main benefit of treating them differently is that we're able to report on them a little differently as well. Let's go ahead and take a look at the More Options report in Production and Income, and then we'll discuss what we can do with this report. So since we were just talking about write-offs, let's go ahead and talk about these options down here first. So because write-offs are quantified in a different way than adjustments in OpenDental, you can essentially change this when you're running the report. So you don't have to go and change a bunch of patient accounts, change the dates on those write-offs or adjustments. You can do that in real time. There are 3 different options when it comes to showing write-offs on the production and income report. The first one here is going to apply the write-off on the insurance payment date. The second option is going to apply it on the date of service or the procedure date. And then the third option here is going to do kind of a combination of the two. It'll apply the any estimates for write-offs that you have. Those will be applied on the date of service. And if the write-off ends up changing at all when you receive the insurance payment, or lack thereof, that will show up as a write-off adjustment. So let's say, for instance, if you estimate taking a $20 write-off on a procedure, normally that's not going to change. So your adjustment would just be 0. If you're using this third option down here, that $20 write-off estimate will be applied on that procedure date, and then there just wouldn't be an adjustment. However, if insurance comes back and for whatever reason the write-off changes, either there was a mistake made on someone's end or they just happened to change their fees or that sort of thing. And the way that this will show on reports is that you'll have that $20 write-off estimate on the date of the procedure still. But if, let's say for instance, if that write-off changes to say like $18 instead of $20, then your adjustment, when you're inputting that insurance payment date, it'll show essentially a write-off adjustment for -2. So if you add up that initial estimate and the adjustment, then you get the actual write-off. The advantage of doing it this way is that you're not changing any historical data. What can happen in that scenario that we just talked about, if your write-offs end up changing, if you're using procedure date, what'll happen is that it'll actually change the write-off on your procedure date. So when you send out the claim, it'll be using that estimate for your write-offs, so $20. Once you receive the insurance payment date, it won't reflect that on the date that you got the payment. It'll go and change it on the date of the procedure, so the date of service. So it'll just change from $20 to $18. So your reports are still accurate now, but what happens is that if you print out any copies, or if you have any printed out copies of your report from that day, you might have to rerun them if you're using this procedure date option. Because now if your printed copy says $20 and what you have in OpenDental says $18, then there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. The other options we'll talk about here are the report types and then the providers. Providers are pretty straightforward. You just select whichever ones you want to show on the appointment, or just check the all bucks if you want all of them. The report type is essentially how the information is displayed. You can take a look at our web manual if you want a little more information on this, but they're essentially all doing the same thing. They just organize information a little differently. So for instance, the monthly report is going to show you one line for each day in the month, versus the daily report is going to show you a much more detailed breakdown of each day that you're running. So daily doesn't necessarily mean that we have to run it for just one day at a time. I can go back and run this for the last week. So let's just change this date to be 8/14. We're using the daily type. And let's go ahead and use this third option for write-off estimates and write-off adjustments. So let's go ahead and click OK. And now you've got a lot of similar things that we've seen before. So you've got the date that this production or income happened, or the date it was entered, the patient name, a description of that item, whether it's production or income, your provider that it was applied to, and then you've also got different columns. So you've got production and adjustments. Adjustments, like we talked about before, these are just going to be stuff like discounts and charges to patients, that sort of thing. Your production, like we talked about before, that's going to be your office fees, essentially, is what's going to be showing in this column. Any estimated write-offs are going to show up in this column, and adjustments to estimated write-offs are going to show up in this adjustment column here, so this write-off adjustment column. You've also got columns that are going to show any patient money that you collected for the day, or insurance money as well. If we also go to the second page of the report, you'll see there's some totals here as well. They're pretty self-explanatory. It'll tell you exactly how it got that number. So for instance, total production is just taking your production plus any adjustments from that day minus any write-offs from that day to get how much you essentially produced. Whereas your income is going to do something similar. It'll just take the money that you collected for this date range. So any patient money plus insurance money. The last thing I want to point out is that having a patient show up on this report doesn't necessarily mean that you've seen them for the day. Like for instance, if you just received an EOB or an insurance payment or that sort of thing, or if a patient just sent you a payment, or if they have a payment scheduled to go through once a month or that sort of thing, those patients will still show up on this report as well. So any income or any production items will essentially cause a patient to show up on this report. And you'll see how essentially everything shows up in a different row if we're using this detailed breakdown using the daily report type. So for instance, you've got an insurance fee increase here, whereas if we actually went into that patient's account, it's actually attached to one of these procedures for the day. But they'll show us separate line items there. The last thing we can talk about is that if we cancel out of this window, if you go into the setup for reports and then miscellaneous settings for the tab, you can change that write-off option from this drop-down here. So if your office uses insurance payment date to calculate write-offs, you can select that from the drop-down or any of these other two options. And that's about it for production and income.
Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. If you have any additional questions, please contact our support line at 503-363-5432 or access our complete online manual at opendental.com, and make sure you're staying up to date on our latest training videos by subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications.